Hello everyone. So before we get into looking at some of the main musical concepts in Indian classical music such as raga, tala and form, we thought it would be important to start this series by providing some contextual background to this music, by taking a look at some of the main historical, geographic, cultural and aesthetic factors which help define it. In other words, what do we mean by North Indian or Hindustani classical music? That's what we're going to be looking at in this video. Hindustani musicians often trace their music's roots back to the Vedic period from roughly 1500 to 500 BCE, emphasizing certain spiritual notions of sound which are codified both in these texts and in the later Upanishads. Specifically, the idea that sound is somehow the audible expression of some kind of transcendent principle, and that through sound one may reconnect with one's true innermost being. Or, as this is often put in a more straightforward manner, Nada Brahma, which roughly translates to God is sound. Without going into too much detail, essentially this idea is derived from the combined facts that 1. The Vedas were always transmitted orally through chant, and 2. That they were considered eternal, therefore meaning that the sound of the Vedas was itself eternal. If the sound of the Vedas was eternal, then by extension sound itself must be the expression of some kind of transcendent reality. The syllable Om in particular, which is always chanted both at the start and at the end of any Vedic ritual, came to be seen as the sonic embodiment of this divine principle. Because of this firmly held belief in the spiritual power of sound, music occupies a particularly high place in Indian culture and is often seen, ideally at least, as a spiritual practice similar to yoga or to meditation. Fast forwarding by more than 1,000 years to the 12th and 13th centuries, this is another crucial period in the historical development of Hindustani music, as it marks the start of the Persian conquest of northern India and the eventual establishment of the Mughal Empire. This historical event led to the split between North and South Indian musical traditions, which up to this point had remained unified. While the Mughals became the dominant political and cultural force in the northern part of India, they were never able to extend their dominance to the southern part of the Indian subcontinent. As a result, while the north became what is referred to as a syncretic culture, combining features of both the local Hindu culture and the imported Persian and Islamic culture, the south remained unaffected by this and therefore a lot closer to its original Vedic roots. This had a profound effect on music, as both the contexts in which it was performed and the functions that it served began to change. Up to this point, music had been performed primarily in Hindu temples and for ritualistic purposes. However, with the Mughal conquest of northern India, music was transferred to the rulers' courts and began to lose its ritualistic function. While music continued to have strong spiritual associations, it also developed in a way which emphasized its entertainment value. For instance, by becoming more expressive, more spontaneous, and technically demanding. Over the centuries, this led to important performative and aesthetic differences between North Indian or Hindustani music, which will be the main focus of our videos, and South Indian or Carnatic music. While both genres share some important musical principles, for instance, a strict adherence to the system of ragas and talas, they differ quite significantly in terms of how these systems are put into practice. Even the ragas and talas used in each genre are different, although some crossover does inevitably happen. An important point to make in this regard is that both the sitar and tabla, which are arguably the two most famous Indian instruments outside of India, belong exclusively to North Indian Hindustani music. In fact, they seem to have developed as a direct result of the interaction between Indian and Persian cultures. By the late 19th and early 20th century, as the Mughal courts became increasingly weak and impoverished, and as European notions of music as high art entertainment began seeping into Indian society, Hindustani music gradually left the ruling courts and became more commonly performed in public concert halls. This too had a huge impact on this music's development, as Hindustani musicians were now required to perform for larger and less knowledgeable audiences in order to make a living, which in turn meant further highlighting this music's entertainment value. However, throughout these profound economic, cultural, and aesthetic changes, Hindustani musicians continue to hold on to the ideals of music as a spiritual practice, resulting in an uncomfortable tension which, to my eyes, continues to permeate Hindustani music to this day. Another important historical development to take place around this time was the Indian struggle for independence from the British, which was eventually achieved in 1947. Throughout this struggle, Indians were keen to find common cultural ground around which they could build a shared national identity, and classical music played an important role in this regard. With its extensive history reaching all the way back to the Vedas, its syncretic nature combining elements of both Hindu and Islamic culture, and its high level of musical sophistication rivaling Western art music, Hindustani music became a perfect symbol of all the best that India had to offer. Once independence had been achieved, Indian governments were then keen to promote this musical art form, both internally and abroad, as an expression of Indian unity and cultural refinement. This eventually led to the popularization of North Indian classical music in the West, starting in the 1950s and 60s, and led by highly renowned musicians such as Ali Akbar Khan, Ravi Shankar, and Ala Raka. If you're a Westerner watching this video, it is very likely thanks to the efforts of these musicians and other musicians of their generation in promoting Indian classical music outside their country. So now that we've had a look at this music's historical development, let's take a closer look at some key aesthetic principles which are of particular importance in understanding and appreciating a Hindustani performance. Firstly, it is important to understand that in contrast to Western music, there is no harmony, or rather, no harmonic movement in Indian classical music. Instead, this music relies exclusively on the development of melody and rhythm. This musical principle is reflected in the way in which a Hindustani music ensemble is constituted, as it will typically have one main melodic performer, normally either a singer or string or wind instrument player, and one main percussionist, either on tabla or on pakavaj. Secondly, it is worth appreciating the primacy of vocal sound in Indian classical music. This principle is primarily derived from the Vedas, which, as I've already explained, were always chanted, therefore positing vocal sound as the closest expression of the unheard, transcendent sound, which according to Hindu thought permeates all reality. Because of this profound spiritual significance of vocal sound, Indian singers occupy the highest status among Indian musicians, and in fact all other melodic instruments, such as the veena, the sitar, sarod and bansuri, are attempts at recreating the sounds that the singer makes. For instance, the way in which a sitar player will bend the string of his sitar is a way of recreating a vocal effect called meend, where the singer will glide from one note to the next in a continuous manner.
जलती हुई पलकों पर शबनम सी बरसती है
Thirdly, like the Vedas, Indian classical music is almost an entirely oral tradition. While a simple form of musical notation does exist, it is used primarily either for pedagogical purposes or as a memory aid. In contrast to Western classical music, Hindustani musicians never perform their music out of a written score. Instead, they approach their performance in a more improvisational manner, somewhat akin to jazz, though with their own musical structures and rules of improvisation, which we'll be discussing in a lot more detail in future videos. The important takeaway from all of this is realizing that Hindustani musicians are essentially making the music as they go, and are in a sense as unable to anticipate what will happen next as the listener is. This gives this music a great level of excitement and, I would say, authenticity, in that the musician is playing whatever he or she feels in that particular moment. In addition, it also means that the interactions between musicians are a lot more spontaneous, and they become a kind of dialogue where musicians need to be carefully listening to and responding to what the other musician is doing. As a listener, becoming aware of this spontaneous interactive process is one great way of appreciating and enjoying a Hindustani performance. Well, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and if you'd like to learn more about Indian classical music, please keep on watching this series as we go deeper into musical concepts such as rag, tal, improvisation, and form. Thank you.